James chapter 1. James chapter 1 and verse number 12. It says, "Blessed is the man that endureth temptation, for when he is tried, he shall receive the crown of life which the Lord has promised to them that love him. Let no man say, when he is tempted, I am tempted of God, for God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempteth he any man. But every man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust and enticed. And when lust hath conceived, it bringeth forth sin, and sin, when it is finished, bringeth forth death. Do not err, my beloved brethren. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, and cometh down from the Father of lights, with whom is no variableness, neither shadow of turning." And I want to preach off of verse 16, but that right there tells you that God does not bring bad things on you. I mean, anytime, God gave me this. No, he didn't. He may have allowed the devil to do it because, he gave the devil reign on this earth over a certain period. But God does not send us bad things. It says every good gift and every perfect gift cometh from above. And it said God can't tempt man. He can't be tempted and he can't tempt man. But in verse number 16, it says, "Do not err, my beloved brethren." And I think most of us know, but err means to wander or to make a mistake. If you look it up, that's what the actual definition is. But there's several ways that we can err and we can wander or we can make a mistake. And one of those ways is we put ourselves in unnecessary situations. And what I mean by that is when the devil tempts us and the devil gets us, we lose a fight of temptation to the devil, all the while we didn't have to be in that situation to begin with. Because there's some times where we go places we know we probably shouldn't go. Maybe it's not wrong to be there, but we know where where it could lead us. And I'm not preaching against any one specific place, but we know in our hearts places we shouldn't go or places we shouldn't be, that maybe not sin, but it may cause something to rise up in us and allow us to be overtaken by temptation. And, the first person I automatically think of whenever I think about being in a place you shouldn't be is Samson. Samson, he wasn't a stranger to God's power moving on him. I mean, you want to talk about an extraordinary show of God's power and God's Spirit moving on somebody is the life of Samson. Because time and time again, God moved on him. And I'm of the opinion Samson was like me or like Brother Shane. Or he was just normal. He wasn't some massive man. Because then, you could... a lot of the stuff he did, you still couldn't explain it, but it would be easier to explain, well, he's just a freak of nature. No, I think he was a normal man, and God moved on him mightily and showed, great displays of strength through Samson. But, Samson, he was in a vineyard when he shouldn't have been, and that led to a fight that he shouldn't have been in, and that led to him touching a dead thing he shouldn't touch. There was just multiple things of Samson, or multiple situations of Samson. And whenever he killed all those Philistines with a jawbone, it was unnecessary because he let the men of Judah capture him and carry him up there before he fought him. That was a battle he really didn't even need to fight. But he allowed himself to be captured by his enemy just to fight. And then, we all know the story with Delilah about how he told her, first he lied a couple times, and, that should have been the first time whenever he told her, if you'll tie me up with ropes, that'll do it. Then she tied him up with some new ropes, and, he shook himself, broke free, and killed the men attacking him. That right there, that would have said, you know what, I think I'm going to go to my house. But she asked him again, and he told him again. But again, it was all so unnecessary that Samson, he would have never been blinded and had his hair cut had he had not have been there. Because he would have never told his enemy where his true power laid, which wasn't in himself. He said it was his hair, but really it was his vow he kept to God. And, I mean, he loosely kept it because, again, he did things. He touched dead animals, and, that was part of the Nazirite vow, and he wasn't supposed to drink wine, and he was in that vineyard. But anyways, Samson, he lived a very mighty life, but then he also had a great downfall. But just because he put himself in unnecessary situations. And, we all know that his hair grew back and his strength began to grow back. And then in the end, he ended up killing more Philistines in one act than he did throughout his entire life. So, he was reconciled there, but it still wasn't the life God intended for him. God still used him. God still moved on him after he broke his vow, after he was blinded, after he allowed the enemy to overtake him. God still used him after that. But you can't convince me that was ever God's plan, to allow Samson to be blinded and to sit and grind on a millstone and then kill himself and a bunch of other people. I don't think that's what it is. And another way that we can err is we begin to not listen to the voice of God. There was a king, and I believe his name was Rehoboam, and he counseled the old men. There was a sort of an uprising with the Israelites, and Rehoboam counseled his old men that God had gave him, and they said, offer them a heart of a servant. He was basically saying, be a servant to them, and they'll be a servant to you. They were approaching it, with love, and he didn't listen to him, and he listened to his younger men that he appointed, and his younger men said, my little finger will be heavier on you than my father's loins were. Basically saying that what my father did, I'm going to do way worse. And he said, my father put a yoke upon you, and I'll put even more. And he lost the whole northern half of Judah. And the only thing that stopped a whole civil war was God went to Rehoboam and said, don't attack. You go back to your tent. And he had to reign over the southern part of Judah, and he lost the whole northern part simply because he did not listen to what God had to say. And there's times to where, God will tell us one thing, but we know better. And an example of that is Jonah. God told Jonah to go to Nineveh. He didn't ask Jonah's opinion about why or whether he should go to Nineveh. But Jonah fled, and it doesn't immediately say, why. It just said Jonah fled. Well, then it gets to it, and Jonah's angry in chapter 4. After he's already went and preached, he's sitting on the edge of town. He built a little hut there and just sat there and waited to see what was going to happen in Nineveh. And he was angry. God raised up the plant and then sent a worm and killed the plant. And Jonah was sad for the plant, and God said, should I not spare Nineveh? You had compassion for the plant. I think it's called a gourd, but it was basically like a shade tree for him. And God killed it. And, Jonah was sad for the shade tree, but he wasn't sad for God's people. He said, that plant doesn't water itself. It doesn't feed itself. But, you had pity on it. Why not these people? And, Jonah was angry that he was even there in the first place. He thought those people deserved, and rightfully they did. But it's not up for us to make that decision because, we deserve death too. But it's not up for us to decide our punishment. That's God, and Christ took our place, and we just have to receive that. But there's many times where God will speak to us and tell us a direction to follow, but we're too stubborn or we're too hard-headed. And by we, I mean me. I'm not saying y'all are, but if you fit in the boat, you can get in the boat with me. I'm too stubborn sometimes to listen to what God has to tell me, and then I've got to learn things the hard way. Because, God did not intend for Jonah to flee to Joppa, get on a boat to go to Tarshish, cause those men to almost lose their boat, get thrown overboard, and get swallowed by a whale and be in the belly of a whale for 3 days, and then be spit out on a beach, and then go to Nineveh. God didn't say to do that. He said, go to Nineveh. God forced him to go to Nineveh at that point, after Jonah admitted to those men on the ship, like, look, throw me overboard and you'll be okay. And but there's just times to where, we know better because we reason it out in our heads. We don't think about it, There's things in our life that we don't understand, even though we think we do. And we try to reason it out in our head when there's no reasoning what God has for us. You can't reason those things. It's like trying to reason heaven. It doesn't make sense that the King of Kings and Lord of Lords would come down and take on the form of a man and die on a cross for us. Reason it doesn't make sense. You can't reason it out. But yet we try to reason out everything God tells us of why we should or should not do it. And that's one way or another way for us to err. But the beautiful thing about it is we're human. It's I think there's a quote that says to be human is to err. We mess up sometimes. Now, I'm not saying you have to. I'm not one of those people that thinks you just have to mess up and have to sin. It's our choice. We're not so helpless to sin that we just have to do it every day. But there are times we mess up and we go down the wrong path. But every single thing I mentioned, every story, every person, every example I mentioned, there was always a path forward. It was never, you didn't listen, I'm cutting you off. There's always a path of reconciliation with God, and especially now after Christ came and died for us, we may have made mistakes, we may have failed, and we may feel that shame, and we may feel that condemnation, or whatever it is that just we failed God. And it's a miserable feeling, but we have to get over that feeling and realize that there's a way forward with God. Now, it may not be the path that you thought it should be, and it may not be the path God originally intended for you, but there's always a way forward. I think I've talked about it before, but somebody I know, he came to me and he said, he used to be saved. He grew up, knowing right, and just he doesn't live that way anymore. And he told me that, he got preached at so hard as a kid that he just thought or as a young teenager and going into his 20s, that he said he had messed up and, done things he shouldn't have. And he said, the way people talked to me about it, I just felt like there was just no way forward, that I had messed up too much to ever be anything. And to this day, he still does not live a Christian life. He doesn't. And it's because we've come down so hard on people messing up. And again, you should strive to be perfect. You should strive to be like Christ. But when you do mess up, you have an advocate with the Father. That's not the end of the road for you. And that's not a free excuse to just mess up and not care. Because I believe if you truly love the Lord and you're truly seeking a relationship with Him, you won't want to mess up. And when you do, you will feel bad. You will feel ashamed. But it doesn't end there, We get that back under the blood and we move forward and we go forward. And I realize that most of us probably aren't making any major mess ups. We're not committing any egregious sins toward God. But if you ever find yourself in that spot that, there's nothing He won't forgive you of except one thing. And, if you're in church, I don't believe you're even guilty of it. I think if you're guilty of that sin, you're probably about as far away from God as you can be. But there's always a path forward with Christ, but it's up for us to be willing to go down that path, because, we can be stubborn too sometimes and like, no, that's my destiny, or that's where I need to be, and that's not up to you. It's up to God, but we have to be willing to go down that road. Could somebody come to the piano? I know it's not very long, but that's just kind of what I had on my heart, that it doesn't matter your past. It doesn't matter what you did yesterday. There's a path forward today for you. But you have to be willing to go down that path. And I've messed up. I remember I got so bitter at people one time, and it was over something. It wasn't good what happened, but it's no reason to get bitter at God and get bitter at your brother and sister in Christ. But I did, and I just thought, this is how it's always going to be. And not everything went right back to the way it was before. Not everything was fixed how I wanted it to be fixed, but there was a way forward for me. And, I decided that way forward with God is better than my way forward alone, because that was where I was going. I was angry and I was bitter, but, I decided that, yeah, I've messed up. I've got angry and I've got bitter, and I've let that into my heart, but that's not where I'm done with God. That's not where my path splits from Him, And so whatever the situation is, don't let whatever has caused you to wander off the path cause you to split ways with Him. Because even when we wander off the path, He's still right there with us. And He'll go with us wherever we go, but we have to be willing to reconcile with Him. If we could all come find a place to pray.